Okay, welcome back to Political Sociology, and this is week 6. We're moving quickly through the semester. I hope everyone is doing well, and you're staying tuned in to the political activities and various events that have been emerging in the United States. You're doing a great job posting various media articles that you come across and the explanation for your selection. So thank you very much for that. As you can see, I'm still in a different location than I was at the beginning of the semester, outside of Asheville. It's very cold out. It's in the 40s this morning, but it's going to be a beautiful fall day here in Western North Carolina. And I'm hoping that all of you are doing well. I don't believe I have seen one person from this class during office hours, and that's quite all right. It's optional, but do not hesitate to check in. And as I've said before, I'm curious about how things are going with your campus courses, since I am doing exclusively online. So this week, we actually have a lot to cover. And it's a significant substantive area within political sociology. Some people might extend these topics over several weeks. In some way, we've touched on them in different ways, but we're going to attack them directly this week. And one of the big questions is, and this is the way we used to pose it back in the day when I was in political science, and doing political sociology and sociology, was who rules? Is there a ruling class? Who runs the joint? Who makes the decisions? The larger question, of course, and the two largest conceptual ideas that drive this course are power, and democracy. Who's got the power? And to what extent is that power used in ways that may or may not enhance democratic procedure, democratic institutions, democratic processes and decision-making? So we get to one of the big debates historically in political sociology, and that is the question of who rules and where the power lies. So let's get started. And I want to talk a little bit about this concept of pluralism, because much of the debate that has occurred within the context of political sociology in terms of who rules is this debate between pluralists on the one hand and elitists. They aren't elitists themselves. That is, they focus on the role of elites rather than what the pluralists focus on, which is a broader distribution of power. So when you talk about elites, you tend to talk about some level of concentration of power. When you talk about pluralism, you're talking more about a dispersion of power. So I just wanted to touch on what we mean by pluralism. And we use this term a lot in social science. And there's really two ways, at least, to think about pluralism, at least two ways. One is social pluralism. And when we talk about social pluralism, we're really talking about the whole range of statuses, positions, institutional affiliations, organizations, voluntary associations, identities that individuals are connected to. The ways in which that those shape the way we approach politics, approach life, interact with people. And the idea is that in a democratic polity, you have civil society. And in a civil society, you have lots of opportunities for different forms of affiliation, organizational, associational. And these can shape your political outlook. So very early in the semester, we talked about mutually reinforcing versus cross-cutting cleavages, and the fact that your affiliation may be in a labor union and your affiliation at the church. Those are two forms of social affiliation. part of the larger context of social pluralism, they might not reinforce each other. They might be cross-cutting. On the one hand, the labor union pushes you left, and the church affiliation might push you in a more conservative direction. And the fact is those are cross-cutting, what we would call cross-cutting social pluralist affiliations. Voluntary associations, as I said, there was an enormous literature back in the 60s and 70s on the importance of voluntary associations in terms of engaging people in public life. And one person who spent a lot of time looking at this not so long ago, and I think he made some important contributions, and actually he just came out with another book on the current disastrous state of American society. I think we can all agree that the country is in shit shape on almost any significant dimension that you can think of, and you're all mature intellectuals, so this isn't obviously going to come as any surprise to you for me to say that. So Robert Putnam wrote this book. I make reference to this book all the time for a variety of reasons, and I think it's kind of interesting that he titled the book Bowling Alone, which is a metaphor for the decline of associational connections and affiliations in American society, what we often call, and what has come to be known as, social capital. So if there was a lot of talk about social pluralism back in the 60s and 70s, this idea of social capital has become very, very significant in the social sciences. And people use it to describe slightly different phenomenon. But for Putnam, the idea was that these different forms of associational affiliation, voluntary associations that we were members of, different groups that we interact with in a variety of different social settings, are fundamental to the vitality of democracy. He's a political scientist, and he focuses on that feature of society which generates what we might call tolerance, openness. I have Norms of Reciprocity. There's a great article written by Alvin Gouldner, one of my favorite sociologists, on the norm of reciprocity. And these diverse social networks that we're connected to constitute our social capital. Now, some people, when they talk about social capital, they're looking at it as a form of capital, as an asset, as connections which ultimately can benefit us personally, materially, in terms of our career. But what Putnam is interested in is the way in which, because we have these diverse connections, associational, organizational, they subject us and expose us to a variety of different kinds of people with different kinds of perspectives, outlooks, political orientations, etc. And that is a valuable way to maybe moderate, but also to develop and cultivate an appreciation for a wide range of perspectives. We talk about polarization today, so that pushes us in an entirely different direction from what Putnam is talking about here. Now, he has this bowling alone, and I often ask students, what does he mean by this? Well, actually, the first thing I ask students is, how many of you bowl? Very few people bowl. I like to say that bowling is a kind of working class sport, if you can call it a sport or recreation or hobby. It has tended to be associated with the working class. There is a joke that the larger the ball, the lower the class. The smaller the ball is being used in the athletic activity, the higher the class. Now you might say, okay, well, bowling is working class and golf is more upper class, but that's just a way one person tried to, with a little humor, talk about differences in social class and different social class activities. But what Putnam is getting at here is people used to bowl in leagues. Okay, that's the key. They bowled in leagues, and they gathered together once a week in a bowling league with people who came from different walks of life, different backgrounds, different experiences, different occupations. And while they were bowling, they talked and discussed various issues, personal, political, social, whatever. And that constituted, for Putnam, a vital, vital element and ingredient of democratic vitality, that you had these experiences, these associational connections, and you participated in different organizations or leagues which exposed you to other people. And you developed a broader, more open, tolerant worldview. Now, people who have studied this idea of social capital say, we have to make a distinction between bonding social capital and bridging social capital. Bonding is where you have affiliations, but they're all reinforcing your preconceived political position. You're interacting with people that are very much like you. You don't have any kind of diverse range of contacts or associations or acquaintances. That's bonding. What Putnam is talking about is bridging social capital. That is, bridging meaning that there are connections being made across different experiences, different groups, different backgrounds, ethnic, racial, political, generational. So what somebody might say is, today we do have certain forms of social capital, but it tends to be bonding. And that is, it simply reinforces our preconceived ideas. We're associating with people like us, and it's an echo chamber, and that essentially reinforces polarization. So there's lots of interesting ways we can talk about the idea of social capital. All right. Now, I haven't really gotten to the issue entirely of what I mean by pluralism versus elitism, so let's keep moving. So back in probably the 60s, maybe even into the 70s, depends what discipline you were in, what courses you took as a student, pluralism was, to a large extent, the dominant political science approach to understanding political power, the nature of democracy, the nature of legislation and decision-making in democratic institutions. And the idea is that, just as I mentioned with social pluralism, where you have a whole range of affiliations and associations and organizations that you're connected with, the idea is that in society there are different interests that are expressed by different groups, occupational groups, organizational groups, business groups, religious groups, you name it. And so you have social pluralism, and it is typically expressed organizationally, and those organizations have different interests on particular policy issues. And so there are lots of interest groups, and interest groups are a key part of the pluralist model. And the interest groups sort of compete with each other to shape legislation, policy, and various kinds of social, political, economic programs. But the point is, there's a wide range of interests. There's a wide range of interest groups. They organize depending on the issue that's being discussed within the legislature. On some issues, they have no interest. On other issues, they do. They organize, they lobby, they express their views. And the bottom line here is that you have a whole range of interests, no single interest, no single group, no single social class dominates. Sometimes they win in one venue, in one area, in one issue arena. Sometimes they lose. Okay? So the idea is there's a lot of compromise. There's a lot of bargaining when interest groups are competing with each other. Sometimes interest groups may not even have an interest to participate, to try to influence policy in one particular area, but they mobilize in another. And so you've got this panoply of groups, organizations, interests. They attempt to shape policy outcomes by the state at different points in time. And so, again, the key point here is that no single group has a position of dominance and political overriding influence in the political system, right? Dahl is associated with the term polyarchy, ruled by many, okay? Poly, multiple sources, centers of power reflected in the range of interest groups, ruled by large numbers, depending, again, on what the issue is, etc. So this was the idea of pluralism, and it was a very agreeable way to think about American democracy. In other words, people thought, well, this is fair, this is fine. If you're concerned with some policy area, then you simply organize and you attempt to shape that policy. You express your interest through the political system, through the conventional institutional means. And it's fair. And sometimes there has to be compromise. Sometimes there has to be bargaining if there are two groups that have very different views about the way legislation should go. And that's the nature of politics. So this was a very dominant image of the American political system in largely political science. So I want to take a quote from C. Wright Mills because we're going to move to him in a moment. Almost all of the sociology students have heard about C. Wright Mills, and he says, not wishing to be disturbed over moral issues of political economy, and I have to emphasize political economy, because when you start talking about political economy, you begin to realize that there is, in fact, a concentrated source of political power and influence. Americans cling to the notion, he says, that the government is a sort of automatic machine regulated by the balancing of competing interests. A machine that sort of accepts and takes the expressions of interest of different groups and processes those demands, processes those organizational efforts, and spits out a policy based on the particular compromise, bargaining, resolution of competition between interest groups. Now, what C. Wright Mills is basically inferring and suggesting here is that ain't the way it works. And what does he think actually happens? So, excuse me for my clearing of the throat. This is my morning congestion. Elite theories. We're going to talk. So you have the pluralist model, and then you have these elite theories. And the elite theories, as I said, focus on concentrated power among particular groups, among particular elites. Mills is associated with the power elite. We'll talk about that in a moment. We'll talk about Domhoff, who's also an elite theory. So the point here is elite theories are essentially an alternative, and within them an embedded critique of pluralism. They reject the pluralist model, and they advance a different view of understanding American democracy. Okay, so you have pluralist approaches and you have elite approaches. I have to tell you that over the many years since Robert Dahl and a pluralist began to present their model, different elite theories have largely supplanted pluralism. That doesn't mean that there aren't lots of different organizations that attempt to influence the political system. The question is, how successful are they? And does that level of competition, if you like, actually produce the kinds of varied outcomes that one would associate with pluralism? Next week, we're going to look at a very well-known study that tried to look at exactly whether, in fact, empirically, there is any support for a pluralist model. So we're going to hold off on that. But for the moment, elite theories are presented as an alternative to pluralism. Okay, so let's keep going. So there he is, the late, hasn't been around for a long time, late, great C. Wright Mills. If you're a sociology major, you've heard of C. Wright Mills. He is held in sort of a kind of folk hero within sociology, a level of esteem. One thing about C. Wright Mills, which made him a sociologist that many wanted to emulate, many respected. He was a maverick. He was a social critic. He never fell into the trap of many, what I would call post-World War II social scientists, who essentially became spokespersons for the superiority of American democracy, American foreign policy. He always had this critical edge, even during a period when it was very unpopular, and in some ways, during the 1950s, certainly, when you had McCarthyism and all of the Red Scare, it was not necessarily a wise career decision to be questioning whether, in fact, the United States was this beacon of democracy, or whether American foreign policy actually promoted democracy and the social welfare of people around the world. So C. Wright Mills was largely a maverick in that regard, because at the very time when 50s and 60s, when American society was regarded as the single greatest country in the world, democracy in the world, C. Wright Mills comes out and says, well, it's not really a democracy the way people think it is. Actually, there are elites. There are ruling elites, and they ultimately control the society. They make the decisions. So he called into question at a very early point in the critical tendencies of social science, and particularly sociology, this notion of American democracy. And he did this in a number of publications, but the most significant, the one that many students are exposed to, even in Intro to Sociology, is the Power Elite. And I would put the Power Elite into the category of institutional elite theory. And what I mean by that is C. Wright Mills, although he was a radical, and some people might associate him with Marxism, and he probably had some sympathy with Marxist analysis, given the way he wrote about social class, his identification of the elite was largely focusing on the individuals who headed up particular institutions within society. Okay? So the representatives from particular institutions. So it's an institutional analysis. You identify which institutions are the most powerful and the people who tend to be in the highest level positions within those institutions. And that becomes the way in which he thinks about the power elite. So the power elite are drawn from military, business, and government. Those are the three institutions that he focuses on. He views those as the dominant institutions in society, and he notices that there is some significant movement across those institutions by individuals. So they head up those institutions, they share a certain particular outlook, and they will move from one institution to another. So you might have people from the military moving into the government. You might have people from the corporate world moving into government, from government into the corporate world. So there's a lot of movement around these three major institutions. Now, I'm also identifying here in this slide a few other ways to think about these multiple centers of power. When we talk about the military, it is very important to recognize something. Many people bring this up because we have totally ignored the warning by President Eisenhower when he left office. Let's remember, Eisenhower was a Republican. He was a general. That was the basis for his popularity. And he was an extremely popular president. He won 2 elections handily over Adlai Stevenson. And Eisenhower warned when he left office about the military-industrial complex. And his concern was that the military was becoming too powerful. It was connected closely with corporate business interests, defense contractors, and that this complex, what he called it, the military combined with corporate interests, was essentially making significant decisions about foreign policy, military policy, and domestic policy. And he warned that they had become far too powerful. This was a Republican military man making this warning as he left office. We obviously did not heed the warning. Today, the military and these corporate appendages, the defense industry, are as powerful and more powerful than they've ever been. Right? So we've totally ignored that. But he was identifying those sources of power. Now, if you read the article by Domhoff, he makes reference to Michael Mann, Networks of Power. This is important. To think about the sources of power in the society. Ideological power, right? Who disseminates the ideas that are put in our head, that shape our political opinions, that shape whether or not we're going to act or not, whether we're going to be passive. The ideological apparatus, what Gramsci called ideological hegemony. Obviously, economic power, corporate power, class power. Military power, as Eisenhower had warned us. And political power, people who occupy positions within political institutions. So those are the networks of power. And for Mills, he wanted to look at the relationship between these. All right, so he looked at the economic, the political, and the military. So in some ways, people have said, Mills is more of a Weberian than a Marxist because there's sort of this multi-dimensional approach to understanding power rather than focusing on one as being dominant in relationship to the others. All right, so the big debate, the big battle, I say the battle lines have been drawn, were between Robert Dahl, who I just mentioned before, and probably his best-known book that advances the pluralist model, titled Who Governs? And there's a photograph of Robert Dahl. If you're a radical political sociologist, you might view Dahl negatively. Over the many years, I have come to respect his work. Later in life, he realized that there were significant sources of concentrated power that totally challenged his view of pluralism. I believe he passed away in 2014. Anyway, he's a giant in political science. And he put out the book, Who Governs? And then we have the sociologist, maybe a psychologist, sociologist, William Domhoff. There's a picture of Domhoff. He's still around. He still writes. He still attends the American Sociological Association meetings. I've seen him there. I've met him a few times. Charming individual. But Domhoff takes on Dahl. To some extent, you could say that Domhoff's life work, and he actually has two strands of intellectual interest. I'll mention the other in a moment. His life work is essentially showing in every possible way that there is a ruling class in the United States. And he wants to identify that ruling class. And he wants to show how the ruling class rules. And he does this by publishing book after book after book. Amazing, amazing career, record, prolific writer, engaging speaker, and a very pleasant human being, I might add. His other area of intellectual interest, and he, I think, has published several books on this topic, are about dreams. That's why I said he might have a background in psychology, but we claim him as a sociologist. How did he make this connection between, studying dreams and what dreams mean, how you interpret people's dreams, and the ruling class? Well, he was studying the dreams of the very, very wealthy. He was actually studying the dreams of what we might call the capitalist class. So there was that connection. So let me show you the next slide, gives you a little flavor. I don't think this covers all of the books that Domhoff has written with regard to this question of who rules. But anytime the pluralists, and Dahl was not the only pluralist, political science was dominated by pluralism. So there were all kinds of pluralists. A guy named Nelson Polsby published pieces showing, no, you're wrong. Domhoff, you're wrong. In fact, we do live in a pluralist democracy, and here's why. And Domhoff would say, okay, I'm going to show you why you're wrong. And he'd write another book. So let me just give one example. He said, well, the corporate elite dominate, the capitalist class dominates. The pluralists come out and say, look, we have a party system. We have two parties. Just two. We know the problems with that, but basically said, and there's a party that represents labor and the working class. So there's pluralism even in this narrow two-party system. Domhoff says, I don't think so. So what does he do? He writes a book titled, I love the title, Fat Cats and Democrats. You can see it up there on the top. You understand what I'm saying? So anytime the pluralists came back with you say there's a ruling class, but he says, no, there is a ruling class. And he writes a book. And he makes an argument. And he lays out a theoretical, conceptual, and empirical strategy to identify the ruling class. This is one of his major contributions. The reading you have of Domhoff is part of a larger website he has, which is designed to assist people who are interested in doing what we call power elite analysis, investigations, power structure analyses. You can do a power structure of the city of Jacksonville. Who rules Jacksonville? I actually put together a small group of students some time ago after I arrived at the University of North Florida. Me and Professor Krista Paulson put together this little seminar group, and the students collected information about various individuals and sources of power in Jacksonville. Who rules Jacksonville? Okay. So power structure research is what he has made the most significant contribution to in terms of other scholars taking his model, taking his approach, taking his strategy for locating the centers of power in any kind of social universe. It could be state level, it could be city, community, nation, etc. So I wrote all these other books, Who Rules America Now, which was an update based on additional information that had been gathered over several different administrations. And the last book that's listed here, The Myth of Liberal Ascendancy, I'm going to talk a little more about that later. So I'm really, trumpeting to some extent the wonderful contributions of William Domhoff. And again, he tries to help us locate or answer the question whether in fact there is a ruling class. And one way he does that, and in your reading you saw this, you should ask three questions. Who benefits the most from policies and decisions? When there's a contest and competition, who tends to win consistently? And who actually governs? Who is making the decisions? And on what basis? So, in his empirical strategy, he tries to answer these questions, and he tries to show that if we ask these questions in the context of American society, we can see that in fact there is a ruling class. And again, the idea of a ruling class is not something that most Americans are comfortable with. Even though if you ask in surveys, do you think, political decisions tend to be made by the people or by a small group of individuals? People tend to indicate that they understand that in fact decisions tend to be made by a small number of people. They may not call it a ruling class, but they do understand that in fact decision making tends to be concentrated in certain hands, a kind of oligarchy. The nature of the oligarchy, the source of the power, lots of debates about that. But when Domhoff started using this term ruling class, it rubbed people the wrong way. And certainly it rubbed political scientists the wrong way. Those who were the defenders of the notion that American democracy was the highest form of democracy in the world and a model for all other countries. Now, for Domhoff, the key point is social class, okay? It's not institutional position, it's social class. The power lies in the economic domain, and the source of power is the ownership of property, okay? For Domhoff, that's the main network. And in that sense, he is certainly more consistent with, although I'm not sure he necessarily describes himself as a Marxist, but more consistently in line with a Marxist analysis, which would focus on class power, than, for example, C. Wright Mills, who is more maybe Weberian in looking at the multiple institutional sources of power. Now, how do they rule? Again, you ask these three questions, you see whether there is, in fact, this group, and then the question is, how do they do it? How do they translate corporate power, economic power, capitalist class power into political power? And he focuses on, and he's written enormous amounts on this. And again, if you go to that website, there's enormous elaboration on each one of these. The special interest process. And he talks about the particular groups that tend to have the greatest amount of power to lobby Congress, to lobby the legislative branch, corporations. Right? He talks about the policy-making process, where policies are developed, where policy ideas get shaped. And he looks at these various, what we call think tanks, institutions, that are dominated and funded by corporations, which put together white papers, policy papers, proposals on political and economic policy. And then he talks about the candidate selection process and the role of money and the fact that the people who ultimately end up before you 9 out of 10 times when you have a choice between candidates, which presumably is all that's required to label something a democracy, that choice is between two people that have already been screened by the corporate elite. Because if you do any research on campaign contributions and the role of money in being a viable candidate, in almost every race, candidates must raise money to run a campaign. That money must come from the sources of finance, which is corporate power. They have the money, they have the dollars. They're not going to give it to somebody who represents political economic interests that are opposed to theirs. They fund those campaigns. And so, to some extent, by the time you're voting, the candidates have already been screened by the capitalist class. They wouldn't have gotten there otherwise because they wouldn't have had the resources and the money to fund their campaigns in the first place. So campaign finance, campaign contributions. And of course, this has gotten even more grotesque with the Citizens United and McCutcheon decisions of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court! We're going to hear much more about the Supreme Court in the next few weeks. All right. Something else that is very important in Domhoff's analysis is this idea that there is a ruling class and there is a cohesion, that they communicate with each other, that they have a common understanding. Again, this was one of the challenges of the pluralists. They said, you talk about this ruling class, there are lots of people that have lots of money, but that doesn't mean that they conspire to make policy, that there's somehow this cabal that gets together and secretly decides on things that should be done. Domhoff writes a book called The Bohemian Grove. Check that out. It's a very, very fascinating study of just one probably unique extreme case of where the most powerful corporate political individuals gather and engage in all kinds of bizarre rituals. A place called the Bohemian Grove outside of San Francisco. Somehow he got in there. Somehow he had people who provided him with information about what goes on there because it's a very private, secretive kind of retreat for the rich and the wealthy. But his whole point is that there is social class cohesion. So this is another part of his analysis. There is cohesion. There is corporate culture. These people do talk to each other. There are interlocking directorates, meaning you have one person who sits on multiple boards of corporations. So if you have lots of people sitting on these boards, they see each other, they talk to each other, they socialize with one another. They are members of the same social clubs. When we did our analysis in Jacksonville, we actually were looking at what country clubs are the most exclusive and who is the member of those clubs, right? This is where people get together. They play golf together, they sit down together, they have lunch, they have drinks. This is where many decisions are made. I have the debutante there because when I was a graduate student in political science in St. Louis, Washington University in St. Louis, I worked with a sociologist as I was shifting over to sociology. And he was looking at the power elite, essentially, of St. Louis. And you looked at the debutante ball, these daughters of the wealthy they have this coming out, it's called. That has a slightly different meaning today. But then the coming out was they would appear at these debutante balls. And so this person that I worked for, his name was Richard Ratcliffe, he would go through the newspaper and pull out the names of these women, young girls becoming women, who are participating in a debutante ball as a way to locate, because only the rich and the wealthy engage in this kind of activity. It's a very kind of Southern sort of thing as well, but not exclusively Southern, but it is associated more with the South. In any case, Again, this reflected a certain style of life, gatherings of people who have enormous amounts of money, and of course, they're passing on this level of privilege to their children. He looks at the merging of ownership and management interests within corporations, and I mentioned the Bohemian Grove study. So my point is, to have a ruling class, you have to have a class that has some level of cohesion, right? They can't be totally dispersed. They can't be totally unorganized. They need to, in some sense, communicate with each other. Now, I'm going to introduce a book that was written recently that talks about the fragmentation of the capitalist class. And there's some debate about that, but it's an interesting argument about the more recent developments within the capitalist class. And by recent, I mean maybe the last 25 to 30 years. This work, like the Bohemian Grove, was probably done in the 1970s or 1980s. Okay, so again, class cohesion, very important. The policy planning network I mentioned before, there are these think tanks. They're called think tanks, but they're major foundations, major institutions where policy is developed by the most powerful sources in the country, corporate sources of power. So most of these institutes, if you go to their webpage and you look at the board of the institution of the foundation, or you look at the affiliations, it's all big money, big corporate power driving all of these. One of the most significant today is the Heritage Foundation. I have links to them here, but just, if you're curious, check them out. Go to the Heritage Foundation and just see what issues they're pushing currently in the context of what's happening in American politics today, the debates over policy today. So the big ones are the Heritage Foundation, the American Enterprise Institute. These are conservative, I would call them somewhat libertarian, sometimes right-wing, financed by corporations that basically hammer out policy statements, white papers, reports that are passed on to legislators. The American Legislative Exchange Council, we talked about that one before. They tend to focus on state legislatures. The Hoover Institute, Council on Foreign Relations, very, very powerful organization. And I have a image of a book that was written about the Council on Foreign Relations called Wall Street's Think Tank. That gives you some idea of the approach that book takes, linking the development of our foreign military policy to the interest of the corporate elite to Wall Street. And the Cato Institute. Those are 5 of probably the most significant policy planning foundations that influence policymaking in the United States. And since Supreme Court issues are coming up, you can check out the Federalist Society, since that is the source for candidates for positions on the Supreme Court. I like to throw out these quotes occasionally. This one again from C. Wright Mills. It is important not to confuse freedom with social power. And this is something that Americans often do. Well, we live in a free society, and because it's a free society, it's a democratic society, and we all have the right to do this and the right to do that, and therefore we all exercise power. He wants to make a distinction between this notion of free to do what you want. By the way, later we're going to have a reading where the question of whether we actually have as much freedom as we think is called into question. But for the moment, let's focus on C. Wright Mills' quote here. There is a distinction between social power and individual freedom. When it comes to social power, most Americans have very little. If, and again, this goes back to his argument, they are not part of the power elite. They do not hold positions within the major institutions of the military, corporations, and government. I put this study in here because I think it indicates how association, connections that we have, shape politics. A couple weeks ago, we talked about the important role of labor unions. If you're a member of a labor union, you have an educational function, and it's a way to develop a level of class consciousness and norms of equity, and it mobilizes people to participate in politics in a particular way. Well, as it turns out, and we might say that this is probably just a reflection of the neoliberal dominance of our political economic system today, and that is that it's the employers that seem to be shaping the political orientation of their workers. Think about that, okay? So I highlighted and read a few of the main points of this study. Very interesting. I would urge you to check it out. So the question is, how does this affiliation, that is affiliation with our employer, shape our politics, right? And in what ways do employers deliberately try to direct our politics in a certain direction? So American employers are increasingly engaging their workers in the political process, channeling their employees into politics in ways intended to support corporate interests. They do lots of research to show the different ways. They say what's most effective is when employers use warnings of job loss to motivate participation, and when employers could monitor the behavior of their employees, suggesting that employers are indeed acting as a type of political machine. So when we think about all of the ways in which corporate power translates into political power, just as we talk about the ways in which labor union members, as a member of an organization, might have their political orientation shaped, what we now see is that it's employers and corporations that have a much more powerful influence. And because of the total, almost universal absence of labor unions, there's no countervailing power. Important concept, countervailing power. Okay, I don't know if I'm going to get through all this in 60 minutes. Let's see. Whoops. Okay. All right. So we're talking about these different sources of power. And I just want to bring up some terms, concepts that people have used to try to understand the sources of power. The duo, Bachrach and Baratz, I read their stuff back in the probably 70s. I loved it because it was very critical of the pluralist model. And they said there's two faces of power. I know I have three faces here because I'm going to add a third by the sociologist Lukes, maybe a political scientist, political sociologist, let's call him that. In any case, Bachrach and Baratz said there's the open face and the secretive face. The open face is the ability, and we can see this, of particular groups to make binding decisions, to make decisions that impact and influence all of us, right? We may not like it, but we can see it. But they say there's something equally important that we don't see, that people don't pay enough attention to. It's not the open face of power. That is the raw exercise of power by powerful groups. It's the secretive face. And what they mean by that is that there are another source of power, significant source of power, is determining what, in fact, is put on the table for discussion. What policy options are actually open? There's this concept called the Overton window, right? Meaning that if the window can be widened, there's a wider range of possible ways to think about different kinds of policies. But if you narrow that, you basically say, okay, we have a policy decision to make. Here are the options. Who decides what those options are? Right? This is what they mean by the secretive face. Right? Who sets the agenda? What is on the agenda? Why is one thing on the agenda and not something else? Why is it that universal health care for years, until just recently, was not on the agenda at all? When Obama developed Obamacare, Affordable Care Act, universal health care, Medicare for all, was taken off the table. It wasn't on the agenda. Okay? So what they're saying is one of the significant sources of power is who determines what's on the agenda. And of course, if we believe that it's class and corporate power, there's obviously some things which are acceptable to them, and there's other things that are unacceptable. The third face, which Luke talks about, is the deceptive face. And that is the ability of the corporate elite, the powerful, the ruling class, if you like, to use Domhoff's term, the ability of the ruling class to shape the way we think. So that's the ideological dimension, right? So we had the two faces of power. Luke said, let's add a third face, which is equally important, and that is ideological manipulation, ideological hegemony, in the language of Antonio Gramsci, what I sometimes call cognitive capture. I'm not sure if I've made reference to this term before, because we talk about regulatory capture and cognitive capture. And cognitive capture is where you basically have penetrated the thinking and the understanding of policymakers, for example, or of the larger population, where they almost automatically think that, oh, in order to see the economy expand, we need to simply reduce taxes and cut regulations. That becomes almost an automatic reflex of almost all political figures, Democratic Party and Republican Party, the neoliberal cognitive capture. Right. So, ideological manipulation, ideological hegemony, shaping the way we understand how the world works and what is feasible and what is possible, right? So think about all of these different faces of power. Okay, I'm getting close to 60 minutes. I forget where I am. I think we talked about this before, restraining myths. Restraining myths are a source of cognitive capture, a source of ideological hegemony, of ideological manipulation. Because we have these ideas in our head, and once we believe them, we are less likely to call into question, to act politically, to be active as political participants. The American dream. Anybody can make it. It's a fair, equal opportunity society. There's freedom. There's mobility. Or Tina, there is no alternative. This is the best possible system we could have. Right. So we talk about those myths, right, that have penetrated American consciousness and it ultimately shape our politics. I also mentioned limiting constraints. It's another way for people to think about deception. Imagination constraints. That people simply automatically, oh, we can't do that. It's too radical. Oh, we can't do that. That would never pass. That's not feasible in our society. Often when you propose radical policies, maybe I shouldn't call them radical policies, policies that could substantially improve the quality of human life, people say, we can't do that. Or, what they often say, and we're going to address this in more detail in a few weeks, there's no way we could afford that. That's too expensive. We don't have the resource. Who's going to pay for that? These ideas have been shoved into the brains of Americans to the point where they have no political imagination to think about an alternative world, an alternative way that we can organize society. And by the way, the elite want you to think this way. They will thank you for thinking this way. It saves them a lot of trouble because you're not even going to demand a significant change in policy because you don't believe it's policy. Pie in the sky. Utopian, too expensive. Remember, imagining alternative possibilities is what politics is about. That's what energizes people. These individuals do not want you to be energized. I'm hitting 60 minutes. I'm going to get cut off. So I will see you on the other end.